It was a really, really good panel that we just had after lunch, and we're going to start off, or I should say we're going to end here on a bang with this discussion about just how do we finance and fund all of this work at the scale that we need, at the pace that we need. So as you take your seats, Ashley Conrad Sade, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Wade. Thanks for coming back in. I'm sure we're going to be joined by people. I mean, we have the Grateful Dead playing, so hopefully we have a little bit more energy going into our last panel. Thank you for that music interlude. So this is our last panel of the day, and then you can have drinks and talk about all of this and spread the good work. This last panel that we just did on sustaining resilience was a perfect segue into how we finance and fund resilience. And we have really just 4 amazing speakers who are going to talk about this work, how they've managed to stack different kinds of funding, and how they've thought about financing in the long term the type of work that benefits all of us. So I'm really excited to be welcoming Nguyen Tara Key from California Forward, Andrew Engler from Rock Rose Risk, Kevin Johnson from PG&E, and Richard Sykes from the Upper McCollum Watershed Authority. They'll speak in order, and then we'll turn it over to executive committee questions. I see the numbers dwindling, so executive committee, take a lot of questions. I'm going to be turning to you. And yes, just thank you. Keep filing in, folks. Find your seats. Okay, Nguyen Tara, over to you.
All right, well, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. It's been wonderful to get to spend the day with so many friends and colleagues from over the years, and so it's really wonderful to be here. I'm Nguyen Tara Key, COO at California Forward, and California Forward is a nonprofit working statewide, really to create a new California economy that's sustainable, resilient, and inclusive. And part of what that means for us is recognizing that anything we're doing on the economy has to incorporate climate. It's a macroeconomic issue. It's a real local fiscal and economic issue to local governments, to state governments, and to our private sector partners that are fueling so much of the economy. Part of what that means is that we need to really be managing climate as a fiscal and economic issue, and the impacts especially that our communities are already experiencing, the devastating impacts of wildfires being one of those, but that we really need to be thinking about climate as a fiscal and economic issue. So that's the lens that I bring to the work that we're doing and to this conversation today. So what I'm going to be doing here, kind of context setting for the panel and for our discussion, I'm going to start just with going over some terms. Many of you know this already and know it deeply, but I find it helpful to kind of just set the stage, do some level setting around some terms that are often used in the funding and financing space. I'm also then going to talk about kind of context setting on why we need to think about who holds risk over what time period, if we're really going to start thinking about how to manage climate as a fiscal and economic issue. And then I'm going to talk about some work that we're doing to really chart out a bioeconomy roadmap, which a huge thank you to the last panel here, because they really set up a lot of the work that we're doing in that space as well. So starting with terms, funding and financing. Again, many of you know this, you know it well, but I think it's helpful to make sure that we understand they're not the same. They need to work together. Financing often has, or requires, not often, but it requires a financial return. There is an expectation that you will get paid back, often with a financial return on top of that. Think your mortgage, think a bond. If you are the state, you are borrowing money, you have to pay that money back, and you have to pay it back with interest, because there is a financial return expected from those investments. Funding is direct funding that does not have a financial return tied to it. There are impacts and outcomes expected from those investments, so they don't not have some sort of a return, but there isn't a financial return expected. I just wanted to lay that out there because they're often used interchangeably. They are not one and the same, and they require different expectations of outcomes. Again, funding and financing, we all know, it has been talked about a lot here today. There is not enough money, funding, or financing to do the work that we need to do. We need to figure out how to grow the pie so that there's more funding and financing. But critical to doing that, again, to where I opened, is really understanding that to think about that from an economic perspective requires thinking about climate risk as a fiscal and economic issue. And I'll unpack that a little bit now. So going to the risk piece, again, context setting here for our conversation. We know that all sectors hold climate risk, but in different ways. And I'm going to walk through an example here that's focused kind of around the home hardening side of things. We all know we need to scale investment in hardening our communities and our homes to withstand and mitigate against the risk of climate. Part of understanding where and how that funding and financing needs to come from comes from an understanding of who holds the risk over what time periods. So we have insurers. Insurers typically hold the risk through one-year policies. That's their time frame that they're thinking about. They're holding that risk in a one-year time. But residents are going to be thinking about and holding that risk for different time periods. You have tenants who on average are going to be these are national average numbers, but be in a home for about 3 years. Property owners, about 13 years. They are going to think about the investments they need to make relative to the risks that they're holding for different time periods. Lenders, same, important role in this kind of ecosystem here, and they're also thinking about managing and holding their financial risk for a set period of time. On average in the US, it's about 8 years. We all know this. What is critically important is that government holds that risk for forever. Government isn't picking up and moving. If they are, we have bigger problems that we need to settle and resolve, but they are holding that risk. I go through all of this with the example around home hardening because we know we have to reduce the risk to those properties. We know insurance plays a role, we know lenders play a role, we know government plays a role. We have been in a place where I think we are leaning on, importantly, the state to help fund and ideally also finance those hardening investments. But there is not enough money at the state to pay for the scale of what needs to be done. Just rough back-of-envelope estimates, if the low end of hardening a home is about $20,000, there's a range, 20 to 40,000, but even if we just take the low end and we just target half of the homes that are in high fire severity zone, highest zone hazard area, that's $20 billion. There isn't $20 billion in the state budget to pay for that, nor is that necessarily the best way to be using limited and important state dollars. So when we're thinking about risk, we need to be thinking about how do we get all of the actors, and this is just a subset, obviously our economy is far more complicated than this one slide, how do we get all of the actors to be paying in and making investments into that? Recognizing government plays a really critical role, which brings us to this slide, why it matters. Again, government holds risk differently than other sectors, than other actors, but government alone cannot fund or finance all of the resilience solutions that we need, even just on wildfire. So what can we do? We can think about targeting limited public funds towards investments where there isn't that financial return, but there is a public good, where there are outcomes that we as a community and we as a state need. And then we can also think about where and how to leverage catalytic investments using those public dollars to create new markets and support economic development. And that's where our bioeconomy work comes in. So we are working as California Forward to really map out a roadmap. What is our vision for a bioeconomy in California? What is a vision for a bioeconomy that brings together California's tremendous riches in our resources and in our resources we have across the state, both thinking about wood utilization and our forests, but also ag. Also, how do we leverage the innovation in the state to really thinking about developing new materials and products? The last panel really hit home and talked about we can be making the investments to get the fuels out of the forest, to be doing thinning, to doing treatments, identifying, how to get that out. If there aren't end uses and products for those resources that we're pulling out, we are not going to be able to have kind of economic opportunity and really develop an economic market that can sustain that work. So we're working to kind of map out what does that roadmap look like, who are the actors in the state and outside of the state that need to come together, how do we think about addressing the many challenges that we have? That last panel really talked a lot about it, so I won't go through it now, but we can talk about it more when we open up. And really thinking about developing our approach to really leveraging and building out California's bioeconomy, really to drive an economic agenda that can help us deliver on our wildfire risk, as well as meeting our critical climate goals that we are committed to achieving. So with that, I will stop and hand it over.
Hello, I am Andrew Engler. I am co-founder and CEO of Rockrose Risk. I am a 20-year insurance veteran, so don't throw anything at me. More importantly, I think the insurance industry has such a critical role, and it's only just been made so much more apparent after the last panel and hearing this over and over again, that we keep hearing this question of, how are we going to stop this from happening, and how are we going to continue to actually mitigate this risk? I'm going to give you basically a playbook today. We did work in Incline Village, one of the 18 regions that we're in, and show an example of how we can actually make this work at scale. This company started with a pretty simple question. You just take Eaton and the Palisades fire and go, insurance companies just lit $50 billion on fire. It didn't go to anything, it just poof in the air. Why in God's name would we not take $1 billion, $100 million, and try and prevent losing $50 billion? I kept asking every insurance executive I could find. I worked at Allstate for a number of years, Argo Group, lived in Bermuda, worked at reinsurers. Funny enough, they all agree. Everyone would absolutely spend quite a bit of money to make sure that we don't lose that amount again every 3 years. Even crazier, I was really inspired to start this with our co-founders, because you could look out in the crowd and see a bunch of them, and one was up here today. I was working with Anacool and seeing this incredible innovation. People like Chris Anthony, who's supposed to be retired, I think, but works even harder than I do. Amy Berry at the Tahoe Fund, and every single person in these governmental agencies, literal saints, trying to do this work, scraping for every dollar, cleaning up our forests, actually de-risking it, going out to communities, hardening these structures, and then still struggling to find that funding. And so it kind of became a clear calculus to us. We, as a retail insurance broker, and today we work with 19 carriers, we would work with those carriers, go to underinsured areas that had seen their rates go up, 300%, or were basically uninsured with the California Fair Plan. We'd work with some of these very innovative companies like BurnBot that could do large-scale fuel reductions at an affordable rate, work with companies that are doing hardening of structure. We gather that information, put it together with risk analysis using AI and other data science methodology, and then go back to an insurer and make a very simple case to them. It's not a goodwill case. It's, again, guys, if they're paying $1 million now for their insurance and we gave them $300,000 back, imagine how many acres they're going to keep mitigating every single year to ensure that they get that $300,000 back. And that might sound crazy, but I have an exact case of that. That is just an example of the hundreds of people that are properties that we're working with right now. And it's called McLeod. So McLeod is the largest HOA in Incline Village. It's about 96 buildings, 215 units, 27.5 acres, total value of $111 million. Back in, I think, 2017, they were paying $200,000 a year for their insurance. As many of you can, I'm sure, relate, that premium jumped up to $1.3 million a year. And that kind of just seemed like a dart at a board. They got zero credit for any of the mitigation they'd been doing. They'd try and ask and try and understand. There's an incredible environment there with Chief Summers, the whole fire department that can give a lot of this help, a lot of these recommendations. And so when we saw this halo protection project that had been done in Incline Village, it was the perfect way to start. And so step one, guys, if you want to go to your insurer, It cannot be a micro picture. You have to first focus on the macro, and that's just evidence-based. You can't say that one property can do mitigation, everyone around them does nothing, and that somehow that property is gonna survive. So that is the first thing we see, and we see exactly here in this county, you have a commitment to do a larger scale treatment. The next step is, it's not rocket science. Insurance companies may not think it, but are incredibly intelligent and very rational about this. They understand that if you reduce fuel, you remove trees like manzanitas around the properties, it does not need to be moonscaped. If you harden the structures, if you make sure that any sort of eaves, closements that are, you put some sort of grate or mesh on, that property is going to be inherently safer over time. And what we started to do is work with them and understand what are those critical elements and how much do each of these affect that risk and how much does that equate to them in terms of like reducing the overall loss potential. When we looked at North Lake Tahoe and Incline Village, you can see that this work, it really does have a large effect, as every single person in this room knows. So I'm not gonna go into it as much as I would probably if I were at an insurance conference right now. But as we can see, there was a significant improvement overall. And what that resulted in, again, it wasn't a goodwill donation that these insurers were making. We actually had 12 separate insurers come in and quote, because what happens is in a healthy market, you're able to make this very strong case to them that this is an outstanding area and this is a marquee risk. They have done all of this work and they plan to do X amount of work going forward. If you give them money back, you are going to be the one that collects this premium, and that's going to be a much safer risk than everything surrounding. And that resonated so much that, the first carrier always comes in and goes, yeah, we'll do it at 8%. And then the next carrier goes, well, they're doing 8%, we should do it at 12%. And what that created was a steamrolling effect. And so this is just one example of dozens in this area and a multitude of other that we work with in California, in Nevada, and Colorado. But really just want to end on that point that I can't thank everyone enough here, and it is incredible to hear. I can only imagine how hard the job is to find the funding, push that in, and the most critical thing we can do at this point now is take an industry that its entire basis is on risk and making money off that return, and correct that cycle again where they are incentivized to put money back into that system. Because at the end of the day, the one thing we focus on most, of course, is we don't want people's properties burning down, we don't want people dying. The second part, as a corporation, they will make more money over time and we will create that sustainable system again. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kevin from PG&E. Work in our wildfire mitigation department. Work on wildfire resilience partnerships. Thank you for having me and us, and I'm just thrilled at 500-person room, and I have a feeling people got turned away. This is awesome. Probably not much of an intro is needed in this forum, but PG&E is an electric and gas utility. It serves about half of the state. Over half of our service area is considered high fire risk. We have over 30,000 overhead line miles that are in that dangerous area, and we're in a state where anything sparked by power lines causes liability to the utility. So, a long way of saying we bear a lot of wildfire risk as a company. This is kind of our evolving wildfire strategy that you can see here. And so it goes back to 2017, 2018, very, very big fires started by utility equipment. And so really, the initial focus was on how do we get power lines to have not start really big fires, which is absolutely the right place to start. As we've gotten more mature and frankly, bought down the lowest hanging fruit, our focus keeps shifting to the right on this flow. For a utility equipment to spark something that turns into a catastrophic fire, a lot of things need to go wrong along the way. And those are all intervention points where theoretically we could intervene and cause those really bad outcomes to not happen. So we are now looking at kind of ignition prevention as one key pillar, but also containment of ignitions before they get big, and then also making communities resilient as kind of the three pillars of our evolving wildfire strategy. So we're evolving on that front. We had a hypothesis that if communities are more resilient, that it's, we're a stronger, healthier company. And so we basically have been, in 2023, funded some early pilots to test if we partnered with communities to help them help themselves, where it's a good idea for us too. Will we achieve good outcomes? Will people like it? Will it work? And so we tested a few hypotheses. Those went really well over time. And then we had some more hypotheses and we tested more. And so now we have kind of a growing portfolio, I guess, of things that we focus on. So here's kind of our current portfolio of different activities, and I'm not going to drain the slide. But there's some key commonalities across these different tools in our toolbox, so to speak. One is that everything is beyond our rights of way. If it's in the rights of way, we have easements. We can do work, and we kind of know what to do. There's a whole machine around it. But when we're talking about making communities safer, that's beyond the right of way. And so all that work has to be done in partnership with the groups receiving funding, with the groups doing the work, with the landowners, et cetera. It becomes much more complicated, and it's not how utilities are wired, to be clear. So we had to build kind of a whole new ways of operating and showing up to be able to do this. Another key piece is that it's not really a good fit for our contractors to do work and our crews outside of our rights of way. And so we are giving grants as a means of creating shared value. So in places where we think there's a ton of value and the communities want to do things that are aligned with what we want to do, if we give them a grant, we all win. A third piece to that is that we want to give grants kind of in proportion to value. So we are looking to return on investment for all of our 5 million customers that we have the privilege to serve. And so some of these categories, looking at utility wildfire resilience corridors, for example, or roadside treatments along power lines, those can be really valuable in the right places, and we'll just fund the whole darn thing. There's a really strong business case. Other pieces that are farther away from wires, where it's maybe more landscape scale, I don't think it's the appropriate thing for us to fund. It's probably also not the best business case, but we can provide a catalytic role. And so the key thing is here, what are the kind of relative strengths of the utility participating and helping to catalyze some of these things? And it's different in different contexts, but this is where, to tee up Richard here in a second, in the big forested context, we can provide a little bit of funding that's very flexible. That could be used if a piece of equipment breaks, go buy another piece of equipment. If you want to do some capacity building and get the tribe kind of trained up to help support the project, you could do that. If you want to use that as financing to then improve cash flow for that project, you can keep dipping into that pool again and again, working with Blue Forest in that case on a forest resilience bond. So those are all ways. Also, if we provide the 10% match to get the 90% public funding in a place where we all share value, those are all ways where we create a lot of leverage and we can get more involved in projects where we can't fund it directly. So there's kind of a sliding scale in terms of what it makes sense for us to do and how we show up. And so we're building this out over time. So the other piece that's important to highlight, so we funded a lot of projects that they've generally all gone really well. We've had learnings, but nothing's really fallen on its face. And so now the question is, how do we stitch it all together so it makes sense as a whole, as opposed to a bunch of one-off projects? And so the direction we're going is to lean into kind of coordinating more at a county level versus project by project. And so we're early starting on this late last year, but in really trying different models with different counties. So Nevada County, El Dorado County, kind of our first out the gate, Butte and Lake coming up behind them, and then we have kind of a pipeline behind that. We're starting to reach our capacity in terms of what our small team and resources are able to do at the moment, but we think we have a model that we could spread all over our 30-plus counties with high fire risk as a way to partner and kind of show up together and co-create these solutions that are a win-win-win for everybody. So last, I'll just highlight in Tuolumne. We've done some cool stuff here too. So with American Forest Foundation, with the Foothill Horizon School, there were a bunch of fuel breaks that were funded by CAL FIRE grants. There was a gap in the middle that the grantee wasn't able to fund, American Forest Foundation, and so we funded the public land treatment to create a continuous fuel break that protected a one-way in, one-way out driveway for students to be able to get in and out, and they're going to maintain that moving forward. Also built out, basically did a holistic forest treatment around a power line, such that you're not going to cut back branches that are going to grow back every few years, but if it's a healthy forest, like our risk is much better, and so is the communities. And so there will be a tour on that tomorrow if you want to hear more about kind of that more holistic approach. And then also did capacity building for a road crew here. The county had a lot of money for roadside treatments, but they were getting very expensive kind of service for being able to do that. And so by providing some flexible funding, they were able to hire some of their own crew, buy needed equipment, and they've blown out the number of miles they would have otherwise done with that public funding. And it gets people out, gets fire trucks in, shared value again. So with that, I'll pass it over.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you for that most recent $50,000 contribution to our Forest Resilience Bond, which I'll talk about in a minute. Last speaker, last panel, so I'm going to take a liberty to respond to a question from the last panel, which is, if you had one ask for the regional forester, what would that be? Those of us who treat acreage on the Forest Service, please go and do some follow-up burning on all those acres. Thanks. And that kind of gets at an observation, which is there was this discussion, well, what about maintenance and implementation, and we should have funding for maintenance. This is all maintenance. This is all deferred maintenance. Every dollar we're getting for grants is maintenance for something that was sustainably maintained, and Don knows who those sustainable maintainers were, but they ended a couple centuries ago. So better get back on track. I apologize for taking those liberties. I'm Richard Sykes. I'm the executive officer for the Upper Columbia River Watershed Authority. We operate in the space, the Green Forest just north of the Cerro Project. We don't have a mill, we don't have Heartwood biomass, and we don't have cogen in our neighborhood. So we operate with a little steeper climb, and yet we are getting some stuff done. So I want to talk about that, how we finance that, and in the 4 minutes remaining here. We were established in 2000. We have about a 10-year history. We do a bunch of stuff, but we have about a 10-year history in fuels management. So we first started doing some, I wouldn't call them strategic projects, but projects here and there in the Calaveras Ranger District, 500 acres to 1,000 acres. So we had some history. That started with a 2016 Master Stewardship Agreement with the Forest Service. So we are comprised of 3 counties, Alpine, Amador, and Calaveras, and 6 water agencies in our region. We call it the MAC region, which is Mokelumne, Amador, and Calaveras. So we've started this large landscape program, and I think maybe the key points here on our goals is it's a partnership. You've heard that so many times. We work very, very closely with the Amador Calaveras Consensus Group, and in fact, they're practically co-authors of all of our plans. We've bludgeoned their poor working group into basically they're just part of the team. We need to make sure, so having a good plan, well vetted, that you can implement is really important. Our goal was to prepare the watershed for grant opportunities. We saw that what was happening with Cerro One, and we are of course jealous, as I just said, no mills, no hardwood. We also aren't a priority landscape, so we didn't attract the $50+ million in federal funding that they received. So we've got a couple phases that we started with the first phase, and this kicked off in probably the end of 2021 and worked in 2022. By 2023, in January, we had both NEPA and CEQA done, and we were starting work on a 26,000 acre footprint later that year. Okay, and so we started with something that we could achieve, which was fuels reduction. We didn't get into thinning, didn't get controversial. There was so much work that needed to get done that everybody agreed upon. That was our space. So this is all on Forest Service property. This first phase was all in the Amador Ranger District, and we focused on the non-commercial fuels thinning. We also realized that's going to end, and it's the same. As we were starting implementation, we started planning, and several of the folks in this crowd have suffered through our planning phase, which is we're exiting soon, I hope. Phase 2 just went 10 times bigger, got more controversial, added fuel. I'll talk about what's in there, but fuel breaks and commercial thinning. So this is just a map on implementation. So if you want to implement something, you can start with your NEPA and CEQA, but you better have a plan that goes from, how do you get down to projects, and how do you get first to grants so you can secure the funding? So that plan helps you secure the funding. You have to have project levels to secure the grants, and then actually do the work. You've got to get right down to the units and the prescriptions so you can get the contracts done. So this map breaks it down to the project level. I don't want to go to the unit level. But acres treated for this phase one work, so this in a modern era of ramping up, we didn't even make 250 in 2023, but we got 1826 in 2024. Last year we did 4,500. I think in 2026, this slide's already up there, we'll have 5,000 acres under contract, and we'll get them done as fast as the contractors can help us. At 2027, I'm fundraising for 2027 now. I wish I had a raffle that all of you could purchase a ticket to operate the Umbra masticator, but we don't have a masticator, so we'll have to save that for the next task force. 10 times bigger, phase two, this is 67,000 acres of commercial thinning, 50,000 acres of field reduction, 23,000 acres of field breaks, and while prescribed fire can be used on all those areas, another 101,000 acres of prescribed fire only. Yes, it's a heavy lift. I ask an unrealistic ask, but getting some of that prescribed fire done would really help out. So when I get to the heart of the SMAC funding, we started with our own funding and probably with Sierra Nevada Conservancy RFFCP funding, which helped us do that initial planning. Then every one of these other grants, from whether it's CAL FIRE, Wildlife Conservation Board, or Sierra Nevada Conservancy, we use a portion of the grant funds to pay for planning, ground truthing, and keeping the engine going. Blue Forest Conservation is a curious thing. We've been working with them for a few years now. We have a forest resilience bond that not only it grants the money to do the implementation, we've devised an approach where we have a zero interest line of credit, and that is capped at $6 million. We used up to 5.6, I think, last summer, just to to pay our contractors. So that was hugely successful. Kevin and PG&E gave us some contribution for that. That contribution was leveraged by other contributions, but that's how you put together that's a financing aspect, but it's both financing and funding. And that financing allows us, we are a preferred entity for contractors like to give us bids. They get paid in 15 days when they submit us an invoice. I need to close up. I call this, hey, this stuff really works. So in December of last year, fire ignition below one of our project areas entered onto the project area. These are just a couple of photos. You couldn't ask for a better prescribed fire. When I asked James Thornock, the fuel staff, I said, why don't you just let it burn? I didn't really expect a response, and I'm not going to tell you what his response was, but if we had treated another 5,000 or 6,000 acres in this neighborhood, you might have been more comfortable doing that. In December, pretty low risk. If CAL FIRE had been in the neighborhood, maybe the decision would be easier. But our future, I think, is to try to facilitate not only getting this work done, whether we call it the maintenance work done on mastication, fuels work, and thinning, but also how do we go back and let's just call it re-entry and retreat at a frequency that keeps these risks low and keeps the benefits coming. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. So throughout the day today, we've been hearing a lot of examples where folks are kind of bootstrapping funding and bootstrapping partnerships to get to these outcomes that are beneficial to communities and to the state as a whole. Are there any sort of universals or lessons learned that could apply to the executive committee that they can take forward that are kind of universal approaches to financing and funding that could be deployed more extensively throughout the state beyond just these individual programs? And when I think about for both PG&E and Rock Rose Risk, I'm thinking specifically that you guys are finding these ways at the community level or the county level. So what are these replicable pathways that are very useful beyond just the projects where you're working?
I'd say first, any complex system is normally a feeding loop that has feedback in it. And if you screw up the feedback mechanism in it, you can have that system start to go haywire. And I'll speak on Kevin's part here. We see this in the insurance industry where insurers, they don't actually take the losses. It's reinsurers behind them. And then the reinsurers go, yeah, we'll take those losses because we're just going to subrogate the utility. And that's great. We're not going to pay for this bill. And at the end of the day, the utility goes, we're going to pay for it. And what happens? We're forced to see higher rates. And so that's what I mean when you break a feedback mechanism that's something strong, or something like, oh yeah, if a house doesn't have insurance, that house is worth less money. And if you start to break those mechanisms, what you see is kind of a breakdown in the system that gives you a very healthy feedback in it. So I'd say one of the critical things about making sure that these projects are scalable is knowing that there is a very long-term view, which is what, I'd say a group like this is so critical for, because as humans, even me, I'm going to think in the shortest term view as soon as one of my 3 kids starts screaming and crying at me, and I'm gonna try and figure out that solution, whether it's my home value, whether it's my insurance premium, as quick as possible. And you have to set these systems up to look 100, 200 years in the future. And it's always not the most comfortable thing, but it is the correct thing, because at the end of the day, if you let it keep happening, we are all going to pay for it over and over again.
I will pile on, which is not a surprise. I agree, it's kind of a systems building game to really make this work, in my opinion. And we have a bunch of systems that were built for 20th century problems, and now we have new problems, and we got to redesign our systems to accommodate kind of this situation we're in today. From the PG&E side, I think the thing that was helpful is we did start to analyze how valuable is some of this stuff to our business. And then once we understood that, we could make investments against it. And I think most of these, so looking at literally, in the case of fuels, our first example, what's the likelihood of buildings burning with current state, and what's the likelihood of buildings burning from a potential power line fire with that treatment? And you're not going to zero, but the risk is going down, and it's a relatively low cost way to get it fairly quick. And if we can share the cost, and it's a really, really good proposition in terms of cost-effective risk reduction. It's really hard to impose that onto companies, but I think that if there can be, new systems put in place where companies understand the value of this stuff and can contribute in various ways, then I think that's how we can kind of build these stacked values. And theoretically, there's water value, carbon value, insurance value, all the different things. And I do think that insurance ultimately, we got to fix the data value chain such that insurance is the feedback mechanism to make people want to do this, and then you can get a lot more investment. So I think stitching all that together is kind of the end game, in my opinion.
I would add on to that. I think, for us as an organization, we're really focused on how do we build regional economies in California that, again, are kind of sustainable, inclusive, and resilient. And part of that is recognizing, given just the scale of California, there is no one size fits all on what economic development looks like in the state. And it is really in the regions where our economy is taking place. It is also, we know this, in California, many of our regions are larger than states combined in land area, in GDP, in population. And so really thinking and taking this kind of regions up approach to how we think about economic development is critical in California. But to your question of what are some universal or cross-cutting things that we have seen is, and we've talked a lot about it here today, is actually having regional scale collaboration and partnership that is so critical. Because as we're thinking about designing, this bioeconomy roadmap, really recognizing that, no single actor can hold all of the pieces that need to come together. As you both were talking about, that whole system needs to come together. There needs to be a place where partners can come together, where, figuring out what partnership looks like, but also how the pieces need to fit together, and how sometimes if we pull one string over here, we don't realize we're tugging on someone's sweater or some other piece of the fabric. And so actually being able to have insight to your point of how these pieces in our economy are stitched together is really critical, and that takes regional scale collaboration, partnership, and that convening space that is so critical. So I think that's one of the cross-cuttings that we see.
Great. Did you want to chime in, Richard?
Just, Kevin mentioned, we're talking about feedback for avoided risk or reduced risk and increased benefits. I think we shouldn't discount a potential water benefit. The update of the water plan 2028 update should address that. I'm looking at Roger. He needs to talk to Joel. But that will attract beneficiaries who have maybe an interest in investment.
That's great. Yeah, I think that innovation of carbon and water and trying to bring others to the table is really helpful. Now, we've talked a lot today about interesting projects throughout the state that have benefited from really committed people, all of you, everyone we've heard from today, who get out there and get these projects on the ground. How do we reach communities that don't have leadership and capacity to go after this kind of funding, but may have incredibly high wildfire risk? How do you find them, support them, and help them figure out financing and funding when they're not necessarily knocking on your door? Anyone?
Yes, it's definitely a challenge. It's been fascinating as we've been doing the county model and piloting that. I'm not going to name names just because but there's one county where the government seems really strong and the nonprofit sector is weak, and we're just partnering with governments there. There's another one where the government isn't that strong, but there are some just amazing nonprofits, and so we're basically just partnering with nonprofits in that county. And then there's another county where it's a blend. So I think it really is going to depend on the place, and I do think there's a place for capacity building. I think that's a hard thing to do. That's the long game. I think we could also, import capacity from regional or national organizations as that capacity is built. But yeah, it's a really important and tough challenge, something to get our arms around more.
I think there's two components to think about here. One is, we live and breathe this every day. Most people don't. And so I think go back to the home hardening side of things. Most people know maybe they need to do something, but don't know exactly what it is. And so I do think there is a really important component of this, of having really clear, simple messaging of the actions that people can take, and using many different messengers to get that and have it be repeatable and clear and very simple, because people are trying to figure out, how to work, take care of their life, their family, their loved ones, and then they're like, oh, and I need to replace my vents. Right, I need to do that this weekend. But then there's other things that are much more expensive. And so figuring out what actually are the steps people need to take and having that clear messaging, because I don't think it has been as clear as it needs to be for people who aren't steeped in this. I think the other piece is we have to show the public positive feedback loops and on-ramps to doing this. And we all know the climate science and the wildfire science that if I harden my home and you don't do yours, then it's kind of all or nothing. And yes, that's true. We also need to understand how people change behavior. They need positive feedback. And if I hear, oh, it's all or nothing, that's a hard way to motivate. So I think we also need to really think about how are we communicating this to show that you can take a step, you're gonna need to do more, you haven't reduced all of your risk, but it's really positive to just start taking those steps and having clear messaging that is showing kind of the positive steps that people can take. The last piece is, I think, really thinking about market segmentation. Some people need direct grants to be able to do the work that they need. They need direct support, they can't afford it. Other people can take out financing. They have the capacity and the capital to be able to do it and the cash flow. And so really thinking strategically about using public money where it is needed most, and then designing financing structures to get to people who, have the ability to take a loan or do additional financing to start making that work happen.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll leave it on a positive note. I think it's every single time we do this, it's so much easier in rural communities. Everyone knows each other. You get these leaders there. Everyone's connected. They have a high school with 200 people, and everyone's kids go to that high school. So we see this kind of community base, and we call it like cult brand is really what happens around this. And so it's easier in these areas. The big question there is, well, most of these areas are on California Fair Plan. And I can only speak for what we've found. Our plan in some of the projects that we've set up for homeowners is, basically we know, all right, we can just give away all of our commission and at least give 16.4% discount for mitigation on the California Fair Plan, put another 8% on, and hopefully that's enough money. And so I don't have the clearest answer for that one, but it is true. That becomes the primary problem, which is the funding of it and being able to get money to those areas. But it's the exact opposite problem of, when we look at a giant, Topanga Canyon or Palisades, where it's actually very hard to get everyone in the same boat together and in the same direction.
Great point.
Yeah, one of the earlier speakers talked about don't let the opportunity posed by a catastrophe pass by. So for us, for UMRA, it was the counties in the neighborhood saw, in particular, the Butte Fire, which burned 60,000 acres. And there's, that was 2015. In 2016, we had a master troops agreement. So I think it happens at the county level. What entities within the county build those bridges. Mm-hmm. And have the capacity. Certainly, UMRA didn't have that capacity. We've built it all over time and ramped up substantially. But I think it is county leadership. So the forums that can make that happen, whether it's mountain counties or RCRC, might be helpful.
Great.
We need Richard to franchise, I think.
Yeah. One last question before I turn it over to the executive committee, which is, we've heard some metrics of success, reductions in insurance, maybe price stabilization, treatments of acres, but what else are you all tracking to know that your work is effective? And I'm thinking about metrics that we could ask and expand to be tracking to understand how effective this work is. So can you just share some of the other pieces that you're tracking internally to know that the work is effective?
So we have a bizarrely, but maybe not bizarre, like very sophisticated risk management infrastructure for the utility industry. And so risk spend efficiency or benefit cost analysis is one of these. So we actually kind of have something built in, like how much risk we get buy down with this versus other things we could do. So that's one, is if we can buy down a risk very cost effectively. Really, I would argue with the previous statement, I think people think their bills are too high in California, and we want to make that slow down or go down. And so where we can make it more cost effective and drive down risk, I think that's good. The other one that to me is the long-term goal. It's very hard to showcase the fire that didn't happen or the fire that didn't spread. What you can show is if people are getting insurance and if they're getting good insurance. So to me, that's a positive indicator. And so from my perspective, like in the nearer term, and this is why we're starting to try to work with insurers more, if we can use the Fair Plan conversion as a success metric, it's a very tangible way for people to know their lives are getting better and something real is happening. So I think making that connection, I think, will be helpful and important.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, I can say that in a very simple sense, looking at it as a startup and from just the more capitalistic side, which is like, McLeod's a good example. We know they're going to save $446,000 a year. Then that kind of puts all the hard work on Anacal. I'm like, how cheap can you do an acre? And how can we decrease that? Because that just becomes a feed forward of, okay, we know how much money is now there. We have to work with that client, and we can continue to bring in more insurers and get their price down. But that gives us that number. And I think keeping it to a real simple calculus on our end gives us a very, very realistic expectation of how much work can get done in the future and ongoing.
That's great. Reed.
Yeah, thanks. I have a great panel, and I've had 3 questions in my mind for a while, and 3 panelists can answer these 3 questions. So first of all, Andrew, huge thanks. The Incline Village case study has been a game changer for us in state government. Like, time stopped when I read that case study, because you guys have made the proof point of what we need to do. So 2 questions. One is, what's the size of community hardening that you really need to drive meaningful reductions in risk? Is it a block or more? Secondly, you worked with the homeowner association, and obviously there's a good centralized model of decision making, so you get everyone's buy-in by virtue of being in the HOA. We're trying to think about what are models to drive the breadth of community hardening that's needed when you don't have, a homeowner model like in a regular neighborhood. So I want to ask that. Kevin, I want to put you on the spot, because I think PG&E and the other utilities have this tremendous responsibility right now to optimize wildfire mitigation investments. And it's no secret that wildfire resilience investments are the reason why utility rates have been on the major increase. I think we're missing a big opportunity. Utilities are spending billions of dollars, ratepayer dollars, on mitigation. The public agencies are spending that, maybe a little bit less, but billions of dollars on shaded fuel breaks and landscape work. What will it take for PG&E to sit down with the national forests or our agencies and compare maps so we can optimize places? Not to remove your collective decision making about where you're going to make the investments, but to me, I'm just stunned that the decision making on where, the vegetation management is done at the utility and where the utility or vegetation management is done in the forest is so siloed. It seems like we have a responsibility to optimize, and I've been a bit of a broken record there, so I want to challenge you with that. And then lastly, great to see Mokelumne and the water agencies that draw water from the Mokelumne make this investment in the Watershed Authority. What will it take to get more water agencies to invest in watershed health, recognizing it's the green infrastructure that it is? You guys have stepped up. There's Yuba Water Agency, Placer County, but it seems like it's the exception to the norm. So maybe just in that. Thank you. These have been like keeping me up at night here.
No worries. Throw something at me if I get off track here and remind me of the question. But one, it does matter which community you're talking about. It can be different in terms of what is that central concentration. The nice part is it's not the entire community, and I'll use Berkeley Hills, this project we're working on. Where you look at Berkeley Hills, there is probably 1,200 homes at the ridge there that protect $8 billion of total insurable value behind it. And so you look at that and you understand, all right, what are the attack vectors coming in the most likely areas that we're going to see an uncontrollable WUI fire move to a structure-to-structure conflagration that's uncontrollable. And we don't need insane modeling for that. I just need to go to the local fire chief and talk to him. The guy's been sitting there for 20 years and knows every single hill and spot, and go, what are the areas that you need to be taken care of that you feel your infrastructure can actually fight this? And we're still going to lose homes. We're still going to have things burn down. It's just not going to turn into an uncontrollable event that's overwhelming that we can't handle. And so we see this, even in places like Topanga Canyon, where you can look and see 200 homes and go, these are perfectly aligned, where if we can get everyone together, they are going to make a significant difference in that structure to structure and how fast that moves and how much we can fight that fire. And onto that second part, it works great, because generally the people who are screaming, I'm sure at you guys loudest or at their local fire chief, are the people who can't find insurance, it's gone up way too much, and are in the most stressed position. So those inherently happen to be the people that are the happiest and extremely motivated to go, we would love to work and figure out some way to make sure we're not paying 12 grand a year when we used to pay 2 grand a year for our insurance. And so that actually works out incredibly well. I would say, look, you only ever have the carrot or the stick. The stick is just too hard these days to try and enforce people and go into a neighborhood and be like, you're the bad guy if you don't. And what we've seen is if you can just get 1 or 2 wins in those areas, it very quickly, even the most ardent person who's going, get off my land, don't touch anything, I love this tree, starts to look and go like, $10,000 is a lot of money. And you just see that change start to happen and them get included in it.
But you won't reduce someone's insurance if they're the only home in the community that's doing it, right? So you do need some critical mass to actually drive insurance reduction, insurance.
That is a very good point. I'd say in a private market, when we're trying to bring back in, especially something that might be like an admitted carrier, they are not going to be able to come back in, or they might be able to write a few homes in that area, but they are not. There's not enough evidence that it's going to protect them. Here's the nice thing about the California Fair Plan. If you're talking about like Fair Plan, then it's just up to us to lose money on it. And so we're excited in that sense that you can use a broker and have the broker give back commission, and it doesn't matter if it's 1 home or 10 homes, it is incentivized for the long term to get that whole block protected and under the single broker, and then moved once it's in a full kind of concentrated zone into a few different insurers. And it'll never be a single insurer just because aggregation is not allowed even on their balance sheets. But I would say it is very surprising how much you can affect with even 100, like 200 homes and going, this is a safe area, and it doesn't need to be 5,000 all in a line good.
There's a lot to respond to your question, and so this might be, we could go offline later on more, but the hardening, to some degree, there aren't that many interdependencies, and part of the marching orders is to basically start with the highest risk and work down. And so there is less discretion in that way, in that we kind of pre-commit to, we're going to work in these places because this is where the highest risk is and where we can take it off the table. In terms of vegetation management, it's largely a compliance-driven activity, and it's really to focus on the wires that might get within 10 feet of, the vegetation might get within 10 feet of wires, and prune it back and cut down the dead trees. The stuff that I talked about a little bit before that we're doing here is much more discretionary, where we actually can go to where there's a lot of work and try and coordinate and kind of pile in. Everything I talked about that I did, though, or that our program is doing here, it's all technically kind of at-risk money. We're going to find out in 2 or 3 years if the PUC thinks this is a good idea or if it was imprudent, and they're going to say and penalize us for doing it. So there's only so much we can really do here until we have clarity on if this is something that they think is okay. So that's, so there's more to unpack there, but that's first response.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I appreciate your utility and the other utilities on this utility committee within the task force. I just want to keep on pushing the idea of identifying ways to work together. It happened at Liberty Utility in the Tahoe Basin, where they did vegetation management coordinated with a shaded fuel break. It protects the community from the utility infrastructure. It protects the utility infrastructure from fire. Just makes sense. You've got your peers in Southern California, Edison, that are starting to do this as well. So I really want to encourage all of us to try to figure out how we help you optimize those ratepayer investments.
Yeah, so we're doing some shaded fuel breaks right now, but again, we're actually doing it in a different way. I think that's more scalable. But again, this is something to maybe take offline. But vegetation management is actually kind of a limited tool in the toolbox. I think we can do more, basically.
All right, question number 3. What will it take for more water utilities to invest in this type of work? I'm a civil engineer, and I've worked for over 2 decades in water utilities and sat on capital steering committee. So you're balancing this investment with all the other maintenance investments that you have in a capital program for water treatment plants, aqueducts, water, distribution pipelines, et cetera. And I've, when I met with Blue Forest when they were still forming their organization, when I was still at a water utility, what it takes is for the utilities, I don't think, to feel like they're bearing the full cost of this. So when I was outside of that utility, I had an interesting conversation with Kevin. I said, Kevin, your $50,000 contribution was what I used to squeeze East Bay Mud for a $50,000 contribution, because you guys have to at least give as much as PG&E is given. So that's a start. So part of it is that they want to feel like everybody who's a beneficiary or everybody who is part of this pool of entities that are trying to avoid a future cost. And the cost for water utilities can be infrastructure. It can be as simple as you're going to have higher turbidity water. It's going to cost you more to treat that water, or you won't be able to treat it, which you pay more. So it's what their exposure is, but they don't want to be seen as having to take care of a majority of the tab. But they'll participate, and it's a meaningful tactic to say, contribute like others in the neighborhood have.
We have some more executive committee questions. We're down to our final 10 minutes.
Yeah, a couple comments and questions. Andrew, first I'll say I'm a former or recovering insurance broker myself. When I went to government, I like to say that insurance is one of the only industries you can come out of. People are going to like you more when you work for government. So I appreciate everything you're doing to correct that narrative. I think the work you're doing is imperative, and I think it's going to create a ton of private investment from homeowners and that sort of thing. So thank you for the work you're doing. My question, though, is for Kevin. In the past, when I've talked with my local representatives through PG&E, they've let me know that microgrids is, a focus that they're kind of toying around with. The idea that if we reduce our line mileage, we can reduce our overall costs. And so I always thought, biomass would be a great opportunity, biomass facilities, to kind of roll out that microgrid concept. Is that something that you guys are still working on at PG&E? Is it something you're discussing? And then in addition to that, with Nwantara, is that something that you guys are looking at in your circular economy as well? And how do you see us getting past this old narrative of dirty biomass, moving towards a new narrative of like, hey, this is actually clean energy. We're able to control the emissions coming out of these facilities. So how do we correct that narrative? So Kevin, again, is that something you guys are still working on? And again.
Yeah, I'm not too close to this, but I'll give you my best shot. We have a program called Remote Grid, which is exactly where we remove the wires as a solution because it's actually cheaper to island basically that property or set of properties, typically with a combination of solar, batteries, and then backup propane. So theoretically, you could swap in biomass or some of that, or at least the propane. I think on a cost basis, it's still hard to justify. It eats into the savings that justifies the remote grid in the first place. And then with biomass, you also have the logistical challenge, I think, of you have to refuel it more. Like just the logistics make it more complicated. So that's just for the microgrids that utilities pay for. Now, customer microgrids, they could absolutely run with that, and there's nothing standing in the way. And I think our remote grid program, I think it's still exception-based, so it's not like we have a ton of these all over the place, so it would just depend on the local context to some degree too. But I haven't gotten any interest from that team on biomass yet, and I did ask once.
Yeah, and what you raised is absolutely something that we're looking into, and I think part of this is the kind of financing, and part of it is a policy kind of perspective. And one of the things that we're really interested in is, we have an approach where we have kind of the primary driver for some of the biomass facilities has been kind of electricity generation through PPAs, and we know those are more expensive than other energy sources. We also have run into this issue of, and you were mentioning it, of kind of the local context in terms of air quality and other impacts. And this is where we really take an approach where we need to be thinking kind of facility by facility, what makes sense in a region, what makes sense from a cost perspective, and then figuring out where are there facilities where maybe it doesn't make sense for them to operate in that way, balancing number of outcomes. Where are there facilities where they need financing to transition to cleaner equipment, cleaner technology, and then where are there facilities where we could actually transition to other types of uses? We don't quite have that roadmap, which is what we're actually looking at. How do we think about kind of place-based and facility-specific needs, and then where are you getting the right financing to help with those bridge and that transition that needs to happen in a place-based perspective?
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for that. And then just if I can have seconds really quick. On PPAs, Kevin, and it sounds like it maybe not your department, but for any local agencies that are having a difficult time establishing a PPA with PG&E, what recommendation would you give for those folks? How can they approach PG&E to get something like that accomplished?
Very much not my department again. I mean, typically we go out to do requests for offer. And it's just kind of whatever the best proposition is at the lowest cost that meets the need that wins. And so it's basically they could submit and win. The challenge is that biomass is pretty uncompetitive. So I don't know if it's going to stand on its own. And every year, I think the proposition gets worse, not better. So I don't really have one. You basically, I think if you wanted to sell biomass, I think the best approach would be to go to community choice aggregators who maybe have different set of priorities to buy power versus the system we have in place at our company at least.
Patrick?
Quick question for Andrew. My first reaction after hearing the Incline example was, and still is, how do you scale that and talk more about that across thousands and thousands of neighborhoods in the state? And what role does this group have in that? Is it moving towards a county-based model? Is it a nonprofit model? Do you establish networks? I mean, surely you've give some thinking to this.
Well, and again, the full credit of that thing goes to Amy Berry and the team there, because there was a playbook written. And then the second part is, what I'm so glad to hear is that playbook is read and actually understood. Because, and let me give some hope here. Our neighbors all the way on the other side of the coast in Florida, they were us back in 1995. Hurricane Andrew slammed into Florida. And if we think our premiums were high, the premiums went crazy with one-way attorney fees, everything going wrong in that state. This year is really the first time we have seen massive rate drops. So much, if you guys are wondering why insurers, you're kind of seeing them come back into the state, it's not because of wildfires, it's because the rates are dropping so much in Florida off of changes in roof structure, changes in the way that like flooding protections are done, and these like litigation financing and other mechanisms, that we are seeing that market harden. Now that's a 30-year process. I don't know if we want to wait that long. And so to your point, it's taking these smaller examples, being able to synthesize what worked and what didn't work inside of it. And I do think you have to start expanding them into larger community areas, because the easiest way to do it is taking the same idea of going, there are so many dollars out there and there's a lot of things being done. You have to isolate and make a very clean format for where are these being driven, and then get some exact value out of it. Because if there is a return, if there's a number behind it, it makes it something sustainable as opposed to like one pops that are done in a place. And so I think that becomes the most critical aspect of it. And then having those community leaders that can follow it on time after time.
Can I add one quick thing? And I can admit it here, but after I left state service, I went and worked in insurance as well. So I've joined the club. And actually, we were working on trying to place that. It's a very similar type of product in California. I think one of the challenges that we had was data and information. And what insurers need, and you can weigh in here, and if you have a different view, is they need pre and post. They need to be able to know that the mitigations actually reduce the risk. And as we were working to kind of figure out how to get insurance to incorporate the benefits of nature-based solutions, of ecoforestry, we ran into challenges where there wasn't as much evidence in that space as there was on knowing what we need to do on structures. And so the work that the task force has done and the state has done to actually develop data, do monitoring, even though, as you were talking about, we need more of that. That is critical, because that's information that insurers are going to use to evaluate the benefit and the return that they can then, write in a specific area. So the data is just absolutely critical.
Well, we are right on time. Thank you so much. It's clear in these afternoon panels and in the morning that these partnerships are just really the engine behind of all of this work. And so just thank you for all of you here today, being in partnership with the small number of people up on the dais. We know that all of you are really engaged in this work, and we truly appreciate it. And you'll have a chance over drinks to develop even more partnerships. But before that, I think the executive committee is going to do a closeout for us on what you've heard today. So let's just thank this panel, and then we'll pass it along to the executive committee.